Thank you very much. Let me jump right in since I want to cover quite a bit with you today. Okay. So here's the agenda. So what I'd like to do with you is to cover a bunch of considerations that come from philosophy, history, political science, that highlight the importance of trade for creating a more equal world, a world of more equal participants in the international regime. So this is the agenda. You're going to see this slide a number of times, and I will begin by simply emphasizing in a historic perspective of how incredibly important trade has always been for making the world that we inhabit, and that is simply because humanity has come out of an evolutionary context in relatively small groups of humans. And in order to get beyond what these small group contexts make possible, we have to engage in exchange with others. So we are good at producing certain things, and to get things that we are not good at doing ourselves, we get those by exchanging them for things that we know how to produce. And trade, trade has always been an activity that channels both cooperative and competitive behavior in human beings. And by channeling cooperative and competitive behavior among human beings has also not just shaped the social structures and political structures in the world, but also simply very much what regions have been used for, what we are doing with land, what we are doing with territory, has been shaped by trade. So let me just give you two examples of commodities, but one could and people have written whole books by way of substantiating how trade has made the world. So sugar is a great example to illustrate this. So sugar is actually originally from New Guinea, was cultivated in New Guinea, spread across Asia, was then taken up by Muslim traders. So the Muslim world had it first, was brought by Muslim traders to Europe, became quite indispensable for many a kind of enjoyment in the European context, and then in fact became so important for the European context that whole swaths of land, whole islands in the Caribbean, parts of South America, Central America were used for sugar plantations in order to satisfy that need. And millions of Africans were kidnapped from their homes in order to do the backbreaking labor on sugar plantations after Europeans had driven the native people, the indigenous people in the Americas, in that part of the Americas to extinction. So the point there is it's not just that things kind of get exchanged and practices and ideas and products get exchanged, but that what we do with space, what we do with territory, how people are moving is also determined by trade. Coffee also illustrates that. It's originally from Ethiopia. Very quickly assumed the kind of function that you just put it to use to also, at least, part of that, right? So it's a social lubricant, and it's making, the often monotonous and otherwise fatiguing flow of days, stimulatingly easier. So that's what we use coffee for. Again, the Muslim world got there first, and it came to Europe via Vienna, actually. So then coffee houses played an enormous social role in Europe in the 17th, in particular 18th century. But then that coffee, just as you could talk about tea in this context, that all had to come from somewhere, right? And so, again, originally from Ethiopia, but then what happened, so Europeans go around, right, and one purpose of colonialism was to see where can we get stuff from that we'd like, and we basically tell certain regions of the world that they have to produce this now, and basically Indonesia, and then also, again, parts of the Americas were told, this is what we're going to do with this territory, and again, population movement followed that. And so, again, one could mention a lot of examples to illustrate this way in which the world that we live in is very much a world that trade has shaped. Now, how do economists, philosophers, respectively, think about trade? This is actually a great occasion to have a constructive conversation between economists and philosophers. So, economist David Ricardo, in particular, has contributed a really brilliant argument, and you've all heard of this, and said this argument also has shaped the world. It's the comparative advantage argument. It's actually a very simple argument, but not even Adam Smith had fully come to it. So it really took David Ricardo then later to formulate this, and that's the standard argument, the standard economic argument for free trade in terms of comparative advantage. Why should you trade? Comparative advantage. Notice comparative advantage here has kind of two meanings. It's comparing one trading partner to another, one country to another. That's not the most interesting sense here. The most interesting sense here is comparative advantage, as in I, as a trading entity, as a person or a country, I think about what, comparatively speaking, I'm best at compared to other things that I could do. Yeah? So the idea is I figure out what I'm best at, what the best use of my time is. With there's certain simplifying assumptions here, but if I have 1 hour, what kind of thing can I produce most of, right? That's a very simplified way of thinking about this. And what I do then is I do only that, right? I specialize in only that. That's my comparative advantage. And everything else that I'd also like, I get by exchanging it for what I'm really best at producing. But again, best in my own terms. So example, Bill Gates, right? So Bill Gates is really good at doing software, right? But let's say Bill Gates is actually better than any of us in anything, right? So the whole list of things, Bill Gates is best at everything. Doesn't matter, as long as he is best in his own terms at producing software, he should still spend all his time, as he has for a while, on producing software, and everything else he gets by exchanging software for other stuff. And that is a completely brilliant argument, and it works completely unilaterally, right? So even if you don't like to trade with me, it still works for me as an argument I will try to trade with you. So that's the comparative advantage argument. And so economists, so sometimes there's these debates when people say, well, actually, we can state all that, and it's purely a self-interest argument. It's a rational argument. It has nothing to do with ethics. It has nothing to do with fairness. And stated as I have so far, as I have it so far, that is also true. But it's actually not really an interesting argument, and that's where the conversation starts with the economists. It's not really an interesting argument unless you also bring in fairness considerations, and there's two reasons for that. One is an international reason. So let's say I'm committed to this argument. I'm sending out my ships. They're doing trading. If the world is not safe for my ships, if there's not an international safety and security structure of sorts, I can be persuaded by this argument all I like, right? I'm not going to get to trade, right? There has to be a maintenance structure of that, and that is a maintenance. If all our ships get kidnapped, off Somalia, for example, right? Then we're not trading, right? So we need an international cooperative system to maintain trade, and so all of a sudden trade is not something that's unilaterally even doable, but it's something that we need to do together, and if it's something that we need to do together, we need to think about what a fair distribution of gains from trade internationally is, right? So that's why fairness comes in that way. Fairness also comes in domestically, because basically what the comparative advantage argument is suggesting, it is saying to every country as a matter of development, go through a self-exploratory process. Think about what you're good at, right? But once you are specializing on that and you say, this is what we're going to do, you are disadvantaging all sorts of other things that are also happening in your country, right? And so your other people also need to be taken care of because they are part of the same structure for which we need to make policies, right? So we need to have a trade policy that gets balanced, that comes with certain transfers and a broader spectrum of policy. So that is another way in which we have to say, well, it's nice to say that trade is really rational, but we have to design it in ways that make sense for everybody. And so it's another way in which the fairness argument comes in. So that is why, as we think about trade, it's important to see both of these things, right? So trade really is good, and in real life, that argument all looks it's more complicated, obviously, but it holds up quite well. But we must never stop thinking about how are we implementing this in an international and domestic system where people are, where countries and individual citizens are treated in some way approximating, as equals, as equal countries in international context, equal citizens domestically. So that's the kind of theoretical background here. How has this all played out after the Second World War? Well, so the Second World War, one of the many important things to say about the Second World War is it put an end to empires. Empires, as several centuries before, had known them because they were exhausted, and all sorts of resistance movements had been inspired by activities during the war. So empires were coming to an end. A new system was needed. What could that system possibly be? We first get to the United Nations, and various things have been done within the United Nations context. Various ways have been explored of how to integrate the newly to be colonized countries in order to integrate them into a world system as something approximating equal players, to at least embark on a process of emancipation. But this process actually that was set in motion after the Second World War was a long road to disappointment for many of these countries. It was a long road of failed integration, and roughly speaking, that's where we unfortunately still are. This is the colonial world in 1945, so these are countries that one or another either are colonizers or colonies. The United States is, obviously, is 1945. The United States is no longer a British colony. This is not why it's on there. That is, at the time, the United States in particular was lording over the Philippines. This is actually not entirely unproblematic to think of that as a colonizer, because in American self-understanding, they were actively resisting the colonial empires of Europeans. Right? So they thought of this differently, but these are subtle differences. Let's set that aside. So this is the world. This is the share of the world that at the end of the Second World War was either colonized or colonizing countries. And then out of the United States, really out of the enormous administrative reforms that FDR had set in motion in the 30s, we're getting basically a global projection of the American New Deal. That is what the United Nations is. So a kind of thinking about public administration in terms of sophistication and also fairness, social justice, that was just not possible before in terms of state logistics and administrative capacities. The Kennedy School of Government, where I work, was also born at this time. It would have made no sense to have a school like this much before that. It's just the thinking about public administration changed dramatically. So we're getting the United Nations. The United Nations is a complex operation. There's not just the UN itself. There's then also these various connected organizations. There's the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and there was also supposed to be this other thing, namely the International Trade Organization. This is not the WTO, this is an organization, it's the ITO. So this was mapped out in one of the biggest conferences that ever happened in Havana on trade, which was meant to basically create a commercial space for the countries that at this stage people already knew would be decolonized. So to make them not just part of the UN, not just part of what the World Bank does, not just part of what the IMF does, but that there is a commercial space created where they can operate as equal players in a world of nation states. So that was the idea of the ITO. That did not come, you have never heard of this, most of you, because it didn't come to pass. The Americans in the end vetoed it. So it did not come to pass. Instead, we're getting this thing, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which is basically a trade arrangement that only was in place among wealthy countries. So basically the wealthy countries said, we don't quite know what to do with this, and we don't have quite enough political motivation to create a commercial space for everybody. We just do it. The commercial space is just limited to a small club of countries. That's basically what the GATT was. But then, as these things go, you let the genie out of the bottle, right? So you can let the genie out of the bottle, but after you do that, you don't quite know what the genie does. But the spirits are free. The UN is to this day, an absolutely fascinating organization, and was especially so in the 1950s and into the 1960s. So the UN bureaucracy became a hotbed of really interesting, forward-looking thinking with intellectuals from around the world. There was a Swedish economist named Gunnar Myrdal who said, if we actually have something like a globally projected New Deal, let's turn the UN into an organization that really is a global welfare state. That didn't really go anywhere. Today, would be laughed out of court right away, but it was actually something that a serious person who got the Nobel Prize in economics then later could propose, and some people liked it. A lot of people liked it. But the more important one was Raul Prebisch, who was an Argentine economist who was really one of the greatest minds, and the UN definitely is often called the Keynes of the South. That's how important he was for economic thought, and so he was the most important thinker for what it might mean to integrate the newly decolonized countries into this new world that was substituting for this dying world of empires. And Prebisch, first of all, so there's kind of two big things that happen here then in the 60s and then into the 70s. And Prebisch was really the mastermind behind both. So first of all, he founds the UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and this is supposed to be a place where these newly decolonized countries congregate, and they start formulating their interest. Nomenclature here is obviously complicated. How do you call them, right? They used to be called colonies and backwater economies. Then, first people started talking about first, second, and third world. That did not some people didn't like that. Eventually, it became developed and developing. Now we talk about north-south. Obviously, this is all hugely problematic, right? There's these are kind of diversity oppressing distinctions. But so this was the name of this organization, and it was it was the first time that something like this was founded, where basically everybody else who was not a previous colonizer got organized, and they tried to formulate common lines of interest. And then something quite remarkable happened. So in the early 70s, we get the oil shock. So where the oil exporting countries basically saying to the rest of the world, if we don't give you oil, then things look like this where you live, right? So we have power. We commodity producers have power. And then basically the rest of the UNCTAD members basically said, okay, if we can do this with one commodity, with that commodity, we can do it writ large. We can do it with lots of things. We actually can get somewhere. If we do things the right way, if we find where the weak spots are, where we are needed, we can get somewhere. And so something then really quite remarkable happened. And let me just ask you a question. Who has ever heard of the new international economic order from the 1970s? Has this ever crossed your way? So this is symptomatic, right? So, and you are a very sophisticated audience, but people have not heard of this. This is the most powerful alliance of developing countries ever assembled, right? This was the time when they were getting very close to really changing the world in dramatic ways. And it speaks to itself that there's almost no collective memory of that at all, right? So this all kind of went away, and I talk a little bit about that in a moment. So, so this is basically a generalization of what happened during the oil shock, right? So long list of demands put together by developing nations coming out of UNCTAD to say, here's what needs to happen so that we live in a world of equals, as equal country. The commercial space, right? So that was supposed to be designed by the International Trade Organization, was supposed to be created this way. And they were so powerful at the time because they actually, once they put their heads together and said, we're actually going to do this together, they actually passed it, right? And wealthy countries, developed countries didn't see much of a choice. They agreed. It's actually passed by the UN. Then you might say, well, why have we never heard of this? And that's because, the one thing here, one key demand of that, technology transfer, right? So technology, they didn't just want to produce commodities, right? So they wanted to say, we need to have our own industrialization, and for that, we need to have some more patent sharing, technology transfer, partly also to make up for the colonial system that was still in place when the Industrial Revolution was not actually shared, right? So the technology transfer did not only not happen, but basically all fledgling operations that happened in the colonies were just kind of sucked out, right? So this was just prohibited in the colonies, and they said to make up for that and to also create a world where we have a shared commercial space, we need technology transfer. That was just one of the central demands of this. And then Henry Kissinger came along, and one of the many things that Henry Kissinger did was he completely dissolved that alliance. So, and at its own level, quite brilliant, but it also had a devastating effect on the mobilizing potential of developing countries. So it was a kind of divide and conquer strategy, right? Because they didn't actually have terribly much in common, right? So developing countries were very different places around the world, and if all you have in common is that you are developing in a dichotomy between developed and developing, then that's not terribly much, and your alliance through a smart player like Henry Kissinger could easily be broken apart. So the whole thing just evaporated by the end of the 70s. And then one last-ditch effort was made. Willy Brandt was called in. And the idea was Willy Brandt was known as somebody who could bring parties together. He had done this for East-West. And people at the UN said, well, if anybody can do this for North-South, which was the nomenclature at that time then, it's Willy Brandt, right? And so Willy Brandt and his committee wrote this really still highly readable report, the North-South, the Program for Survival report. But you have probably not heard of that either, because again, this all kind of went away, right? So this was almost like falling dead from the press. So this was when neoliberalism came in. Hayek and Friedman took over. Gunnar Myrdal was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics the same year as Friedrich August von Hayek. And not only did he refuse to accept the prize, he advocated for the abolition of the whole prize if people like Hayek would get it. So that's how the animosity to how strong that was. But neoliberalism, that's when neoliberalism took over the world. And we have a lot of amnesia about all these fascinating things really that happened before. So this is what the 80s looked like, right? So the 1980s, generally known as the decade of development, and typically what you would know about development policy, development organization starts with the 90s. And it's not your fault. This is how these things are passed on, right? And so in the 90s, then we finally get a trade organization, that is the World Trade Organization. It is only a faint shadow of what was intended by the ITO in the 1940s. In particular, there was, all these plans in between for technology transfer were explicitly rejected. There's now the TRIPS, right, the technology-related aspects, the trade-related aspects of international property. So basically, technology transfer was made a lot harder, right, through massive patent protection that the developing countries had to accept in order to get some access to global markets. But none of that worked out very much. So developing countries lost quite a bit in this process by conceding a lot of things ex ante and not really getting much in return coming out of that. So it was bad enough already when Trump came into power, and then Trump came to power. And he might yet come back, right? So, this is the man, and so it's only a matter of once the January 6th committee is getting serious about filing charges, he's going to declare his candidature, and that will end all the charges that might possibly come out of the January 6th committee. So he might come back, but before it comes to that, so he immediately starts a completely new style of trade policy, and it's not entirely idiosyncratic. So this then started to happen and was happening anyway all over the world. So international agreements are being replaced with insistence on autarky. We do it ourselves. We become independent in this and that regard. And by doing unilateral or possibly plurilateral trade arrangements, we're not interested in global arrangements. So Trump very much so. And there was then one particular day when Trump's measures in this domain were so extravagantly against any WTO arrangements that's when the death of the WTO was proclaimed. And the effects of this have been quite lasting. So one thing that Obama actually started this already, but Trump did this at a large scale, namely to say we're just not approving judges for the appellate body, right? And so one thing that was really good about continues to be kind of good about the World Trade Organization is that it has this appellate court whose decisions actually have teeth, but only if countries abide by it and only if there is an appellate court. So the Americans basically just stopped approving judges for the court, and so that is what happened. And generally, the gist of trade policy in many countries, and you see this, it's in the news all the time, right? So it's everybody says, we have to do this on our own, or we make these arrangements. Germans go to Qatar, talk about gas, and so the unilateralism, maybe plurilateralism, but there have been recent developments about the WTO that have been somewhat better, but that's also just not how it works in international relations, right? So one president withdraws American participation in all sorts of, it's not like Biden comes in and says we're going to restore this all, right? There's always too much to lose in this way. So the COVID was a global stress test, and it looked really good for a while. We had all this talk about globally sharing vaccines, and everybody was excited, and all that fell apart, right? So the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, so they were all kind of involved. This is more for the World Health Organization than for trade. But in spite of all the promises, and to this day there's a lot of pretense in this, would have been a great opportunity for global solidarity, also technology transfer. BioNTech is producing stuff in Africa. It's possible to produce stuff in Africa, but they're not actually doing the technology transfer. They're putting containers there, they're sending their own people, they're not sharing anything. They're just producing it there, right? So we're not doing any, in spite of all the pretentious rhetoric around that. So as a global stress test for solidarity, and this is actually really bad because we're going to see more of this and we're going to have a need for global solidarity, and this was a total failure. So we have situations like this. South Africa, right, badly hit by COVID, badly needs vaccination. Vaccination rates in Africa are substantially below what they are in many other places. So as a test, again, as a global stress test, this was a total failure. What we still find, globalization is thinning out. International organizations are, not in good shape. Globalization still does work for the wealthy. So we still have a financial system. It's not quite as good for that purpose as it used to be, but we still, by and large, have a global financial system in which capitalist system can move with ease. absolutely astronomical amounts of money are being held in offshore tax accounts and tax havens, and basically not reachable for public taxation, massively constraining policy spaces. Opacity is the norm. Where do we stand? Well, there's a litany of challenges, right, for which we need global cooperation. So climate change, the arrival of AI, we need to put our heads together around these things. It's very obvious, right? And so that international organizations are now falling apart, are not there to create a world where countries operate as something approximating equals is a real problem right now. Trade, of course, is still good, it's important, it still brings people together, not quite at the global level, but it's also still creating wealth. But we find, obviously, if the wealth is not fairly distributed, political reactions are undermining the potential of trade. So this is also a long history of failure of wealthy countries taking the rest of the world seriously. Do not be surprised if the rest of the world doesn't answer the call when you say, well, Europe is in trouble with the Russians attacking Ukraine, because then they will say, well, what have you ever done for us? Right? There's so many conflicts like that, and you didn't care one bit. Right? So there's no history in which you have tried very hard to do things for us. So there's a connection to the Ukraine situation here. Technology transfer could still have been, can still happen, and this, I think, badly needs to happen. This is something that we need to advocate for. Otherwise, it's so that the fact that people don't know about the new international economic order really does speak for itself. I sometimes think Carl Schmitt was right in the end. He might still turn out to be right. So Carl Schmitt thought the colonial empire. The colonial empires would be replaced by great spaces, what he called, so basically countries having their security zones around them, something like that. Of course, we see the Russians insisting on that, the Chinese insisting on that, the Americans also to a large extent insisting on that. So a little bit goes this way, but what we currently see mostly, we're not quite there, right? But to my mind, the most important thing to say about the current state of the economic order is what we have. We still have a version of globalization, but it's plutocratically enormously constrained. It means the wealthy still benefit. One can park one's money if one is properly connected in tax havens and move the finances around. But what we also find, given this constrained version, developed countries are settled with populism because redistribution doesn't happen properly, right? There's no sophisticated industrial policy, certainly not in the United States. And developed countries are suffering from extremely constrained policy spaces because international commercial space was never created for them. That made sense in any way. Sorry, I went over time. Thank you for your attention.